All right, my name is Matt Anderson. I'm the director of the Coalition for Self-Government in the West at the Sutherland Institute. Joining us for this morning's public panel, or public lands panel, we have a few people. I'll invite them to come up right now. We have Dr. Randy Simmons, who's the president of Strata Policy. We have Wade Garrett, who's the director of public policy at the Utah Farm Bureau. And lastly, we have Casey Snyder, who's the former legislative director for Congressman Bishop. So thank you all for coming. Today's panel will last 30 minutes, followed by 10 minutes or so of questions from the audience. So with that, I guess we'll get started. And I think you know they're legit because there's not one person on that panel who's not wearing cowboy boots. So there we go. All right.
You want to see what mine have on them?
Yeah, what do they have?
Don't ask that. In honor of Congressman Bishop, I'm not wearing socks.
He does today.
Well done. All right, so the first question. Few policy areas are as heated as the debates over how to best manage federal lands. Shouting matches, internet hysteria, and hostility have come to define the issue. Why do you think this is the case, and what can be done to tone down the rhetoric and frustrations?
Do you want to start in order, or Casey?
They called your name first. I'll back up behind you.
Thanks. So they are very divisive issues, but some of you may be familiar with what Congressman Bishop and my boss, Congressman Chaffetz, started to do about 6 years ago. Was that how long ago we started trying to PLI? Another lifetime. But part of what we tried hard to do is bring lots of voices into the room from all aspects of public land interest. At the time, Casey was actually working for an organization, Trouts Unlimited, and helped us put together a 2-day tour, which we had 50 stakeholders, probably, close to.
There are a bunch of them.
Went into the wilderness, or the Sitla block in the Book Cliffs, and we actually built some good relationships there. It goes back to what Congressman Bishop may have alluded to earlier. We have these percentage of people that are making a living off the shouting matches and the suing and other things, because there was several times that reasonable heads, I felt, were making good progress. So I think we need more of that dialogue. And to Congressman Bishop's credit, he was one of the first people that I think brought both sides into a room to have those kind of discussions.
The way the current laws are structured, people who don't want to change current uses have the complete advantage. Why should you compromise if you can keep the status quo? There is no incentive at all for compromise by those who are opposed to changes. So there's that problem. Another is just the emotion, the rhetoric. This public lands they're a symbolic issue. They symbolize, I don't know, all kinds of things like it used to be the Marlboro Man, but he died of lung cancer. But they're important symbols to a lot of people, and when you start talking about managing forests, it sounds like you are going to destroy them. And it's just that whole symbolism. And it was, if we back up, I think Congressman Bishop missed one piece of the history, and that was the Public Land Law Commission that started in 1964, I believe, and they produced their report called One Third of the Nation. I think that was anyway, it identified the public lands as being 1/3 of the nation and suggested a major change in what was being done. They proposed doing away with disposal, with transferring lands to the states, and we got in 1977 the federal, we got FLPMA, Federal Land Policy Management Act. Is that what that is? Which ended the era of disposal. Legally, legislatively, it ended. And so then we've built from there. I was at the original Sagebrush Rebellion meeting in 1980 at Little America in Salt Lake when Ronald Reagan called in and said, "Hey, I'm a sagebrush rebel too." And everybody was so excited who was there, at least all of the folks wearing cowboy hats. And there were a lot. And then I went to work in the Department of the Interior in the first Reagan administration. And one of the things we had on our agenda was what was called asset management, which is simply looking at all the assets that in this case, the Bureau of Land Management primarily had, and saying, which of these makes sense to keep and which ought to be sold? Well, the Congress, I mean, this is 1982. The Congress stopped us. They put in the funding bill for Interior that no money could be spent on asset management. They didn't outlaw doing asset management. They just said you can't, no one can spend any time or any money on it. And so the lines were really hardening by 1982. And then Jim Watt, who was Secretary of the Interior, tried to honor some coal leases that existed within wilderness areas, and that sort of blew things up. And then there was challenges to the Interior's coal leasing programs, and just a snowball of challenges and lawsuits that have been running ever since about 1977. And so it's this history, it's the legal status, it's the emotion. And you know, I can listen to Rob talk about all of these things that have been done and how it ought to be different. And he lays out facts, and facts don't matter, not a bit in this debate. What matters is the emotion. It's symbolism. And if you try talking facts, no one listens.
So I think I'll jump in there and sort of combine history and most recent and maybe a little further back. And I've thought a lot about this question, listening to the other folks, and if you want my honest opinion, I think the source of conflict on public lands is ownership. And what do I mean by that? Well, I'm not engaging in the states versus federal land ownership debate when I say that. I think it's fundamentally when you say something is mine and someone has a use or a desire to operate on something that is mine that is contrary to what I see as important, you are setting yourself up for conflict. So because we say it is public lands and my piece is as important as your piece, when there is a disagreement, we are going to fight. It's the same thing you would do if there's a reason I run my house and my farm this way. It's the reason I drive my truck. And then we take that ownership label and affix it to an entire landscape and expect everybody just to get along even though it's mine. And I think, honestly, the only true way to move past the debate and to move past the history of conflict is to recognize that it is ours, that these are our public lands, regardless of whose name is on the management side of things, and that if my interests are going to be maintained on that landscape, they have to be as equal and as important as yours. And the only way to get to that point is to sit people down in a room, sit them in the middle of the wilderness like Wade and I did a few years ago, and make them figure it out. Make people talk and recognize that while different, each person's perspective has value. And that's the only way I think we move forward in this debate.
Thanks. All right, I'm going to skip to the next question because Congressman Bishop touched on it. I think it's so important. We're going to start with Casey on this one, as he is a wildland firefighter. Much of the wildfire debate has only focused on what is causing fires instead of offering sensible policy solutions. How can the federal government be more proactive and forward-thinking in how it manages for wildfire?
So I'm a volunteer, which means you're going to get not a professional opinion, you're going to get a volunteer firefighter opinion. So sort of giving that disclaimer at the onset. I think when it comes to fire, we have to recognize that in a landscape, it's sort of oft repeated, but I think it's worth saying again, you're either going to graze it, log it, or burn it out on federal lands. There is trying to say that there's some equilibrium where if we do nothing, eventually forests will hit this homeostasis, or whatever, however you say it, where everything will be fine if we just do nothing, is completely factually inaccurate. And so we have to recognize that we have to do something, and we have to make a decision based on preferences. And maybe your preference is grazing, maybe your preference is logging, and maybe your preference is fire, but we have to make that decision. It has to be a conscious decision, or we will be left with the only alternative, which is the default to things will burn, and they'll burn in a catastrophic way, which will limit all other future uses. So I think recognizing that we have to do something is probably the first step. And then I also believe that recognizing that in that triangle of the three uses that I mentioned, fire is one of them. And fire has to be part of the conversation. And I think for so long, we have treated fire solely as something that we fight. Listen, as someone who rides in a big truck with flashing red lights, there's nothing more in the world that I want than to run really, really fast, put wet stuff on the red stuff, and go home feeling like a hero, right? Like, that's the coolest thing in the world. But it's, in the long term, that is completely and totally the wrong approach. We have to recognize that element has to be back into the system. And at the federal level, if we're going to prevent sort of a catastrophic fire, which sterilizes the soil, like I said, and makes things impossible, we have to slowly bring that back. And there are substantive policy corrections that we could make that would address those issues. Chief among them, honestly, would be slight modifications to the Clean Air Act, because we cannot apply fire into fire's necessary systems in any other window other than largely the summertime, because there's restrictions on air quality. So finding ways that we can offset and introduce fire into a system in the spring and in the fall, and maybe move around some of the higher standards of the Clean Air Act so we don't suck smoke all summer would be not an easy, but a very substantive and immediate fix.
It's pretty important to remember that fire has been part of the American landscape for probably 10,000 years. And by that I mean intentional fire, fires set by humans. And Native Americans used fire as effectively as the first settlers in the East used the plow. They used it to manage the landscape. So, for example, when Europeans first made it to Yellowstone, you could drive a horse and a team through almost anywhere in Yellowstone that was flat enough, because the trees were that widely spaced, because they ran fire through that place at least once every 25 years, and it kept the brush down, it kept it open. It was a way of trying to manage for wildlife, because they needed to eat. And so when Europeans showed up and saw these open forests, they thought this was such a wonderful place. But then we didn't use fire. And I think Casey's completely right. If we don't actively use fire, especially at the time of year when you can run a low-intensity ground fire as opposed to a crown fire, if you don't allow that kind of fire treatment and other forms of management, then the only other alternative is this summer and just burning the hell out of the West.
I think I echo a little what they say. My grandfather turned 99 years old 3 weeks ago, and still pretty coherent. And we were talking very recently about these fires. And to Randy's point, west of Nephi, if you drive along there, you see a great pinyon juniper encroachment. Well, he talks at times in his lifetime that wasn't there. And they weren't logging it, because they don't log those. And they were probably grazing it equal, because a lot of that right there on the front is private land. But the equation we have taken out, and we've got to figure out how to put in, grazing's super important. As a grazer, that's a tool. Logging's a tool, but we're not going to log and we're not going to graze JP forests. We're just not. So we've got to figure out a way for treating them. And Casey's point is well taken. We've let these things come in because we got really good at fighting fires, and Smokey the Bear's campaign was over. Another federal program gone wrong with Smokey the Bear, in my opinion. So we got really good at putting out fires. I fought fires 30 years ago as well, only I didn't spray wet stuff. I took a great big machine, just pushed trails, and it was fun. But we were good at it, and too good at it. We could get fires out pretty quickly with a bulldozer in the late 80s, early 90s, and I think we have to reintroduce that to get rid of the catastrophic. And there's going to be some catastrophic to get back into equilibrium, whether we all like that or not. And I think sometimes we don't like to admit that. Now, can we manage those? Yeah, I think we can do better, and some of the things these two gentlemen spoke of, I think, are excellent ways to help bring that into equilibrium.
So, Matt, the State of Utah Division of Natural Resources, Department of Natural Resources, did some chaining in central, south part of the state earlier this year. Chaining is when you take anchor chain and hook it between two big caterpillars and drive across the landscape and rip up everything.
Done that too.
You've done that. That was a way to try and take pinyon juniper out, because nothing grows under pinyon juniper. It's a way of creating a form of desert. But chain it out so that you could then seed with good grasses and have a very different landscape from the one that PJ had created. And the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance immediately had an ad on TV about how terrible this was and how they were just destroying Utah. And Department of Natural Resources produced a video like almost overnight that they then, it was on the internet, they put it on TV, that just showed how wrong everything was that SUA had said. And SUA withdrew their ads. It was the first time I've ever seen them do that.
And a slight follow-up to that, and in the hearing I attended a week or so ago that Congressman Bishop did, and Casey was on that panel as well. You're a good panelist, Casey. You're just everywhere.
It's my face.
So, and I don't think so.
Certainly not your clothes, Casey.
Another issue we've gotten into, so I also, in a prior life, I ran a dozer, which we ended up on a lot of rehab projects as well as a lot of chaining and fire. But the kind of grasses they tried to want us to plant were native grasses that only was going to come in optimum conditions. And they didn't want you to plant other grasses that they may not be native, but they're not going to burn like our non-native cheatgrass, and that's going to come in no matter what. And so I think another thing we can do is when we do have these burnouts, we've got to give some flexibility. Even as of right now, they are looking at some of these up in Box Elder County that they want to put some of these native grasses back in. Well, in best conditions, they're not easy to get established. So in the conditions we're having right now, there are grasses we could get established that are fire resistant, and then if we can beat the cheatgrass out, then we can probably come back in and look at the native grasses. But some of the rules we have right now make it really tough to get anything but cheatgrass because of the seeds they have to put on.
Crested wheat.
Crested wheat's one of them. That's a great grass to do that.
Absolutely. Well, Casey and Wade, the way you're talking about wildfire fighting, I think I might be switching careers. It sounds kind of fun.
It was fun.
All right, next question. Demands for recreational access and opportunities are increasing throughout the West as the population grows and new types of recreational activities emerge. Can recreation and other traditional uses of our public lands coexist, and how? I guess we'll start with Randy this time.
At Strata, we actually did a study of counties all across the West, making comparisons of their how well their economies were running, how well they were doing. And with the exception of places like Moab and Jackson Hole, where there's just where the recreation value is just so high. The counties that do best are those that have a mix of recreation and what other development is possible in that county, whether it be it oil or logging or mining. But the ones that have a mix of uses are the ones where the economy does best. I was actually surprised at that. I didn't expect that the mixed use ones would do best, but according to our data, they do.
Yeah, and I just echo that with sort of the comments that I made earlier, that we all have to recognize that each use is valid and important, and oil and gas industry is a beneficial economy in many places, but it also has sort of a cyclical fashion to it. It's how the market is driven. Recreation is an important tool, and it's an invaluable resource, but it's also very seasonal and not necessarily as prone to big economic gains and opportunities maybe as some of the development industries. And livestock is critical, and it is sustainable over the long haul. That's why you have ranches that are on their 5th and 6th generation. So finding ways for folks to get along, recognizing the value and importance of each other, and integrating them into an economy, into a public landscape is critical for us to be successful as communities and as individuals going forward.
Can we get Casey to briefly tell us a story of the diversion on the Bear River that he accomplished while working for Trout Unlimited, because ended up improving fish habitat as well as making the farmers at least no worse off, if not better off?
Yeah, I'm happy to mention that. It's been a long time. My therapist has really said I'm not supposed to reach back into my past too much. So, but I'll tell you what I remember.
I'm your therapist, so you're all right.
We are all in so much trouble. So we did a project. Gosh, it's been almost 10 years ago now, Randy. On the Bear River, just outside of Evanston, Wyoming, and the canal company up there had a ditch that basically lost over a couple mile stretch of flow about 60% of the water that was in it. So you started at the top, and by the time you reached the first diversion, most of your water was gone because it was canaled over a basically glacial till. It was going over a gravel pit basically for several miles. And so we worked with the local canal company to say, well, let me back up 2 steps. Below that point of diversion, they also basically dewatered an entire section of stream. So they took a bunch of water, stuck it back in the ground, didn't get any on their fields, and killed a whole bunch of fish in the process. So kind of seems like a bad opportunity for everyone. So what we did is work to find ways that if we said to the canal company, hey, if we move your point of diversion down a couple of miles, we'll actually get it off federal lands, which will make it way easier for you to manage and repair this diversion. We'll be able to rewater several miles of stream. We'll be able to change your how much is actually going back to you at the end of the ditch, because we'll not go over a gravel pit. And oh, by the way, the local bottling company, Coca-Cola, takes a whole bunch of water to make soda pop, and they're interested in conserving water, and they'll count this as a project and give you a whole bunch of money to do it. So there was this sort of diverse interests. Everybody set up initially for a lose-lose. Through working together and finding commonality, was able to create the win-win. So I think those kind of projects, those kind of partnerships are key for all of this. But thanks, Randy.
Casey took some of us out there, and before they got the project finished, and the way that they diverted the water into the canals was they drove a cat up the bottom of the river for several miles, dropped the blade, did a push-up dam, which just means you drop the blade, you push up all of the gravel, and divert every bit of water into their canals. And now there's water flowing. The farmers are better off.
Yeah.
But how many years did it take you?
A long time. Like, it probably took 6 years or more through permitting.
And a lot of that was spent sitting in farmers' kitchens talking to them about why this is a good idea.
Yeah. It's a nice selling point that now those farmers when they divert their water, they sit on a cell phone in Evanston and they drink their coffee and they say, all right, I want water to go to my ditch. And before they had to, like you say, drive a dozer up the middle of a stream. So there's opportunity out there.
I think these two make a good point. And I have had an interesting, I just don't know what I'm going to do when I grow up type of deal, I guess, because I've still ranch, I've mined our federal lands, and I've recreated on them, and I've even done a little lodgepole logging. So I've kind of played all sectors. And I've found the communication with a majority of these people, believe it or not, we have the shouting matches in D.C., but as I'm driving cows down the Mount Nebo Loop, I don't think I've ever been yelled at. I've had my picture taken a lot, believe it or not. This face has had its picture taken a lot.
It's a good face
Yeah,
for radio.
yeah, it is. Excellent. Not a good voice, though, so we're good. But, and I've had a lot of interchanges with recreationists coming over the Loop Road from mostly Utah, but all over the country at different times. Doing my mining project, I'm proud of rehab that I can take you back and show you that recreationists now use. And I think, so the mixture that you spoke of is so important. And then I look at the recreation economy. I live in a county with one of the larger BLM recreation areas in Little Sahara Sand Dunes. It doesn't do anything for Juab County to have Little Sahara Sand Dunes sitting in it. It doesn't help our economy, but we get 60,000 people, 70,000 on Easter weekend that all come in through Utah County and leave us the burden of paying for that. So I think there's got to be ways we can partner to help counties that end up with the recreation burden on federal land to be able to afford having the recreationists there, because we're not Moab. We don't get anything from that. So I've kind of had a diverse kind of life that, you know, realizing we can work together, but part of it's communication, and part of it, some of these recreationists, if they want the recreation economy, which I think is important because I've been a recreationist, need to help supplement that, some of these smaller counties that get hit with it.
That's a great point.
Matt, I asked the Trout Unlimited attorney about this project that Casey described. I said, so is this an example of free market environmentalism? He said, I don't know what that is. This is environmentalism that works.
That's excellent. Well, with that, we're going to open up the questions to the audience for about 10 minutes. So, and if anyone has a questions, we'll bring around a mic to you, and please raise your hand.
This is for anybody, but particularly with the possibility of Secretary Zinke bringing the BLM to Utah, how do you think that could help shape the public lands debate? How do you think that could help shape future policy out here in the West? With most people, you know, east of the Mississippi thinking BLM just stands for Black Lives Matter and not, you know,
Yeah.
Bureau of Land Management, you know, it could potentially be huge. So I'm just curious as to what you gentlemen think.
I'll go really quick, but Congressman Bishop alluded to that a little bit in his presentation. I think anytime you get the folks that actually have to make decisions closer to the decisions they have to make, I don't care what industry you're in, the better off that you are. So to me, if we move folks out here that are making these decisions and they can actually go see the effects of their decisions, one way or the other, it becomes very, very helpful. When you can fly 4.5-hour flight away from here and make decisions, some of those folks, as I was talking to the acting director of BLM, he has folks that make decisions about the West that have never been in the West. Now, let that sink in for anybody. I don't care who you are. They're making a decision about something that's happening here to an area they've never yet been to in their career. That ought to scare the hell out of all of us, no matter what we hold. So that's my thought on it.
By the way, the acting director of the BLM is a Utah State graduate, Brian Steed.
Yes, go Aggies.
There, in Interior, there are at least 5 Utah State graduates, all in really important decision-making roles. Just saying.
Well, 3 Aggies too, right? So it's good.
Yes.
But you don't have a bias, do you, Randy?
Not a bit.
Okay.
I have never been accused of bias. I think moving them here would be a really good idea. It's useful to just get out of. We have a president who talks about the swamp, but it's a echo chamber, sort of all talking with each other in the building and not coming out to see what's going on. I think it would be a great thing to move them. I'd also move the Bureau of Indian Affairs to the Aneth chapter of the Navajo Nation. Let them see the effects of their policies.
You know, I think this is, all in all, it's a good idea, but I also believe that if the move stops at just an office building, you're going to end up in still a very bad place, which I would consider now not a good situation for the reasons articulated. So, for example, we have the state office of the BLM, state of Utah, in Salt Lake City, and we have the regional office for the Forest Service in Ogden. And I would make the argument on many occasions, I have seen those offices be every bit as bureaucratic and everything else as DC. So there is substantive benefit from moving it, but you also have to figure out ways to get your line officers, those who are making the decisions for the people who have to be on the ground, in the dirt at some point in their career, and not just sort of read everything on paper and make a decision. On-the-ground experience matters regardless of position or placement.